I've delivered to strange places before, but that warehouse on the outskirts of town definitely made it to the top of the list. When I picked up the order, my supervisor didn't even look at my face. He just gave me the address and said that I needed to take a batch of small boxes, nothing heavy. When I got there, the owner was already at the door, a little impatient. He was an older guy, with a tired look, the type who had seen too much in his life. He gave me a quick look and said something that bothered me at the time. "Don't take long in there. Just drop the boxes and leave. And don't pay attention if you hear something." He said this in a somewhat dry tone, but he didn't seem to be joking. I laughed awkwardly and asked what he meant by that, but he just shook his head and opened the door. The place was huge, bigger than I expected. Rows of rusty shelves stretched all the way to the back, stacked with boxes, old furniture, and a few things that looked like they had been forgotten for years. The smell was strange, somewhat stuffy, like dust and damp wood. As I entered, I noticed something leaning against the walls, spread throughout the warehouse. Mannequins, a lot of them. Some dismantled, others whole. But they all had that empty look, that lifeless expression that always gave me goosebumps. It didn't look like normal store stock. There were too many mannequins of different styles, as if they had been gathered from various places over the years. I tried to ignore it, to go straight to where I needed to leave the boxes, but I couldn't get the feeling that I was being watched out of my head. As I walked through the warehouse, I felt a growing uneasiness. Every time I passed the mannequins, I had the feeling that something was wrong. At first, I thought it was all in my head, but then I started to notice strange details. I was sure some of them were in different positions than when I entered. A mannequin that had previously been facing the wall now appeared to be tilted slightly toward the hallway. Another, who I was sure was missing an arm, now appeared to have both. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just my brain playing tricks. Maybe the dim lighting was confusing me. But at the same time, I knew something wasn't right. I quickened my pace. I wanted to leave those boxes and get out of there as quickly as possible. The problem was, the more I tried to ignore the mannequins, the more I felt a presence around me. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched, it was something more physical. My hair was standing on end, my breathing became heavy, and my entire body seemed to scream for me to get out of there. When I finally reached the delivery point, I almost threw the boxes on the floor and turned to go back. It was at that moment that I heard it, low, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere among the mannequins. A breath. I froze for a second, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it was an old pipe releasing air, maybe the wind passing through some crack. But it wasn't. The breathing was rhythmic, slow, and came from close up, as if someone was there, hiding among the mannequins. My heart started to pound in my chest. I looked around, trying to find some logical explanation, but all I saw were those expressionless faces lined up against the walls, motionless, or at least appearing to be. That's when I made the mistake of blinking. When my eyes opened again, one of them had changed position. There was no doubt this time. He was closer. I felt an icy shock run down my spine. I couldn't ignore it any longer. My body acted before my mind processed it. I started walking quickly towards the exit, without looking to the side, without giving my head a chance to create more paranoia. But as I walked, that sound came back, breathing, now stronger, as if he were following my steps. I forced myself to keep walking, but with each step, the feeling that something was moving behind me grew stronger. It was a type of fear I had never felt before, a pure, instinctive fear that made my skin crawl. I wanted to look back. I wanted to confirm that this was really happening, but I knew that if I did that, I might not be able to move anymore. So, I continued. My steps got faster, almost running, and it was at that moment that I heard a dry noise. Like plastic dragging across the floor. Something had moved. Something big. That's when I couldn't take it. I turned my head reflexively, even though I knew I didn't want to see. And I swear by everything I saw one of the mannequins in the middle of the hallway, right in the path I had just passed. He wasn't there before. He couldn't have been there before. His arm was slightly raised, as if he had just taken a step towards me. My chest seized up, and the only thing I could do was run. I ran without looking back, feeling the weight of every shadow around me, hearing those low sounds, almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore. I could barely feel, my feet touching the floor. The warehouse seemed longer than when I entered, as if the exit was getting further and further away. The heavy air made it difficult to breathe, and the only thing I could hear was the hurried sound of my own footsteps, and something else coming close behind. It wasn't quite a loud sound, but it was there. Plastic scraping against the floor, a slight creak, as if something rigid was trying to move without making a sound. The worst thing was that I felt it. That presence. It wasn't just imagination. It wasn't paranoia. I knew I wasn't alone in that place. When I finally saw the exit door, relief washed over me for a second. But it was at that moment that I felt a violent shiver run up the back of my neck, as if something was right behind me. My entire body reacted before I could think, and I threw myself forward, pushing against the door with all my might. The light outside blinded me for a moment, and I stumbled outside, almost falling to the ground. I turned back, expecting to see something, anything. But all I saw was the dark, silent warehouse, with the mannequins motionless in one place, or at least that's what it seemed like. I stood there, panting, trying to understand what the hell had just happened. My eyes darted around the inside of the warehouse, looking for any sign of movement, anything that would confirm what I had felt. But everything seemed normal. Too normal. The store owner was still outside, watching me with that tired look. I tried to say something, ask what those mannequins were, what was going on in there. But my mouth just wouldn't form words. He just sighed and closed the warehouse door without saying anything, as if it were just another ordinary day for him. I got into the truck still shaking. My hands were sweating so much that I could barely start the engine. The whole way back I tried to rationalize. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the bad lighting and fear had my mind playing tricks. But no matter how much, I tried to convince myself the goosebumps on my skin were still there. And then, when I arrived at the company and went to check out the delivery, I made a comment trying to sound carefree. "Hey, that place is kind of weird, right? I swear I saw those mannequins moving." My supervisor didn't even look up from what he was doing. He just shrugged and said, as matter-of-factly as possible, "Yes, we all saw them move too." I've dealt with a lot of strange cases as a social worker, but this one still haunts me. When I was given the case of a woman who hadn't left her house for over a year, I thought it would be another one of those scenarios of extreme isolation, perhaps severe depression or agoraphobia. But the neighbors' reports were what bothered me most. They spoke of screams in the night, of shadows moving through the windows, even when she was alone. One of them, a man who lived on the floor below, said he heard something scratching the walls. At first I thought it was exaggerated. People love to create stories based on the unknown, so I scheduled the visit and went there without thinking much about it. The building was old, with narrow hallways and dim lighting. When I knocked on her apartment door, it took me a while before I heard footsteps on the other side. The handle turned slowly, and when the door finally opened, I saw a pale woman with deep circles under her eyes and disheveled hair. The smell in there was strange, a mix of musty and something metallic, almost like iron. She didn't look me in the eye right away, just held the door open enough for me to walk through. As soon as I entered, I felt a heaviness in the air, as if the apartment itself was dense. There was something about the atmosphere that made me uncomfortable, a tingle on the back of my neck that I couldn't ignore. She guided me into the room without saying a word, and I noticed how everything there felt wrong. The curtains were drawn, blocking out most of the natural light, and the air was heavy, damp. There were piles of papers spread across the floor, dirty dishes on the table and sofa, and in the corner of the room, a chair facing the wall, as if someone had sat there staring into space for hours. But what bothered me most was the silence. Not the normal silence of an empty apartment, but a kind of absence of sound that made it seem like the world outside didn't exist. Not even the noise from the building reached there. I sat on the couch, trying to ignore the suffocating feeling, and asked how she was. She finally looked me in the eye, and what I saw there wasn't just fear. It was despair. "There's something here with me," she murmured, her voice weak, almost lifeless. "He won't let me leave." At the same moment, a dry noise came from the wall behind me, as if something was inside it, scratching lightly. I froze for a second, trying to rationalize, but her expression said it all. "He likes to hide. Stay inside, listening." My throat felt dry, and a shiver ran down my spine. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, and asked how long this had been happening. "Since I moved," she replied softly. "At first it was just whispers. Now, he talks to me." I tried to maintain my composure, but this place was affecting me in a way I couldn't explain. With every second that passed inside, my body seemed to react instinctively, as if I were in enemy territory. "Have you ever thought about leaving here?" I asked, trying to understand why someone would stay in a place like this for so long. She laughed, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It was a hollow, humorless sound, as if I had said something absurd. "I already tried," she said, looking at the half-open hallway door. "He won't let me." Before I could ask what she meant by that, we heard a loud crack coming from the bedroom, something like wood giving way, a dry noise loud enough to make me jump on the, couch. She pressed her hands against her knees, her eyes wide, and I swore I saw something move in the dark hallway. At this point, I no longer knew what to think. My rational side insisted that it was her paranoia, that perhaps she was going through a psychotic break and I needed to help her. But my intuition screamed that there was something very wrong there. I got up slowly and said I wanted to see the room. She didn't try to stop me, but she didn't follow me either. I walked down the narrow hallway and felt the air become even heavier, as if I had entered a pressure zone. When I pushed the door open, a strong, damp smell hit me. The room was a mess, clothes scattered, the mattress without sheets, and on the wall next to the bed, scratches, many, some superficial, others deep enough to have ripped off pieces of paint. I swallowed hard and took a step back. It was at that moment that I heard it, low, almost imperceptible. A breath coming from inside the wall. My body locked up. It wasn't the sound of a creaking pipe or the wind rushing through cracks. It was slow, deep breathing, as if something was just behind the wall, watching me. My first instinct was to try to rationalize, but then I saw her eyes in the hallway. She wasn't surprised. He just looked at me with that blank expression, as if he already knew exactly what I was hearing. "Do you understand now?" she muttered, without even moving closer. My heart was pounding, and I barely realized I was holding my breath, until my chest hurt. There was something inside that wall. And whatever it was alive. I took a step back, trying to control the panic that was beginning to rise inside me. But before I could say anything, a new noise filled the room. A hoarse whisper coming from inside the wall, low enough to sound like it was right in my ear. I hurried out of the room as quickly as my dignity allowed, and she followed me in silence. I didn't know what to say. How could I say anything after that? What I saw, what I felt, was not something that could be explained with a simple, fertile imagination. "Can you help me?" she asked suddenly, and her voice caught me by surprise. I wanted to say yes, that I would get her out of there immediately. But the truth? I had no idea what to do. I gave my number, promised that I would come back the next day with a solution, any solution. But I just wanted to get out of that apartment. And when I finally stepped out into the hallway, the air seemed to change, as if that unbearable weight had been left behind. Little did I know that that would be the last time I would see that woman. The next day I spent the morning trying to contact her. I called several times, sent messages, even considered calling the police for welfare. But something told me it wouldn't help. At the end of the afternoon, I decided to go back to the apartment. When I arrived, I felt immediate discomfort. The hallway seemed quieter than the day before, as if the building itself was, holding its breath. I knocked on the door a few times, waited. Nothing. I tried to call her name, hearing only the muffled echo of my own voice. That was when a neighbor, a suspicious-looking lady, appeared at the end of the corridor. "She's gone," he said simply, before closing the door as if he didn't want to continue that conversation. My heart raced. What do you mean, gone? She hadn't left her apartment in over a year, and then the worst came. The apartment door was unlocked. I hesitated, but entered. The smell that was once musty and damp was now dust and abandonment. The room was empty, with no trace of anyone living there. The dirty dishes were gone. The piles of papers on the floor were no longer there, as if she had never been there. I walked into the room and felt a chill running up my spine. The scratches were still on the wall, just as I remembered. But the rest, it was as if the apartment had been unoccupied for months. My chest tightened, and I was about to leave when my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. A new voice message, unknown number. My hands were shaking when I pressed play. The audio started with a faint hiss, as if it was recorded in a very quiet environment. Then I heard her breathing. Low, irregular. "You finally let me go," she whispered, almost in relief. After that, silence. The audio had nothing left, just that whisper and an emptiness that seemed to extend beyond what I could understand. My entire body shivered. That didn't make sense. Who had sent that message? If she really had left, why did the apartment look abandoned for months? And most disturbingly, what did "he let me go" mean? I left the apartment in a hurry, trying to organize my thoughts. I called the number the message had come from, but it was out of service. I went to the building administration, asked about the woman who lived in the apartment. The doorman looked at me like I was crazy. "This apartment has been empty for a long time," he said. "No one has lived there since last year." My mouth went dry. I was in there. I spoke to her. I saw the scratches on the walls. But now there was nothing. No records, no belongings, no evidence that this woman ever really existed. Just that audio. The only proof that, for some reason I would never understand, something or someone had finally let her go. I had already been working with night deliveries for a few months, so strangeness was something that was part of the routine. I've seen it all. Bizarre clients, unusual requests, people who made me question what I was delivering. But that night the feeling was different. As soon as I accepted the race, a strange chill ran down my spine. The request had no name, just an isolated address, far from any busy area. The strangest thing was the instructions. Leave it at the gate. Don't knock it, and don't turn around. At the time, I laughed. I thought it was some prank, a prank. But as I needed to reach the goal, I accepted and went. The drive was long, and the longer I drove, the more the feeling that something was wrong intensified. When I arrived, there were no lights on. The house seemed abandoned, without any sign of movement. The iron gate was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. I took the order and got out of the car, feeling absolute silence around me. Not a single cricket, nothing. I left the bag on the floor, right at the entrance, and prepared to go back. I made sure to follow the instructions exactly because, I don't know, there was probably some crazy person who liked these things. But the moment I turned around to open the car door, a bright headlight illuminated everything behind me. A car had stopped there, right next to mine. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the doors opening and 4 men coming out, walking towards me in a manner that didn't seem friendly at all. My first instinct was to get in the car and get out of there as quickly as possible, but when I tried to open the door, my fingers were shaking so much that I could barely hold the handle. The guys didn't run, but they walked in a firm, determined way. One of them was holding something in his hand, but in the darkness I couldn't see what it was. I just knew I didn't want to find out. My body stopped for a second, and during that time, one of them said something that I couldn't understand, but from the tone, it wasn't an invitation to have coffee. That's when I realized I didn't have time. If I tried to get in the car, they would catch me before I could start it. My only path was the forest next to the house. I ran without thinking twice, feeling the damp ground slipping beneath my feet. The branches hit my face, tearing my skin, but I didn't care. I just wanted to put as much distance between myself and those guys. Behind me, I heard voices and hurried footsteps, breaking the dry branches. They were following me. My chest burned from running so much, but I couldn't stop. I threw myself behind a fallen log and held my breath, trying to listen. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then one of them shouted something and the footsteps returned. This time more spread out. They were looking for me. I stayed there, huddled behind that trunk, trying not to make the slightest noise. My breathing was fast. My heart was beating so hard I swore they could hear it. The cold from the damp ground was beginning to rise through my body and my legs were shaking. I don't know if from exhaustion or pure fear. They walked slowly through the trees, throwing lanterns from one side to the other. I saw the beams of light passing near me, illuminating parts of the grass and fallen leaves. At one point, one of them stopped so close that I could hear his heavy breathing. My entire body tensed. If he looked the wrong way, it was over. But then, one of them whistled in the distance, and the man headed in the direction of the sound. I don't know how long I stayed there. Minutes, hours. It seemed like an eternity. With every sound of breaking branches, I held my breath, ready to run again. But little by little, silence returned. No voices, no flashlights sweeping through the dark. I waited a little longer to be sure, and then I slowly crawled back until I found a place more covered by the bush. I stayed there until the sky started to lighten. The fear was still clinging to me, but the exhaustion was starting to weigh more heavily. As soon as I felt it was safe, I took courage and returned the same way I had fled, with my body bruised, dirty, and my clothes torn. The worst was over, or at least that's what I thought. When I finally emerged from the forest and returned to the dirt road, I felt momentary relief. The sky was already a pale blue, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again. But as soon as I reached the place where I had left my car, my stomach sank. He wasn't there. The space where I had parked was empty, as if I had never been there. I looked around, hoping to see some sign, some clue, but there was nothing. No tire marks, no broken glass, nothing to indicate that my car had been taken. He just disappeared. The house was still there, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. For a second, I thought about going over there and asking, but my instinct screamed at me not to do it. I needed to get out of there. I picked up my cell phone to call a taxi, but the screen said, "No service." That gave me goosebumps. My signal never failed, even in the most remote areas where I had made deliveries before. I walked a little along the dirt road, trying to find a better position, but nothing. I was in the middle of nowhere, alone, with no car and no way to ask for help. That's when an idea came to me. Open the delivery app, to at least make sure that order was still registered. But when I accessed my history, I felt a knot in my stomach. The order wasn't there. As if I had never accepted it. As if that race had never existed. I stood there, looking at my phone screen, trying to process what that meant. I knew I had accepted that request. I remembered the address, the bizarre instructions, the dark house, the men chasing me. None of that could have been a delusion. But then, if the request never existed, how did I end up there? How did my car just disappear without a trace? A shiver ran up my spine. Everything felt wrong, as if I had entered a place I shouldn't be, a space that didn't follow the same rules as reality. I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I continued walking along the dirt road with no other option but to continue forward until I found some civilization. After a while, I finally saw a fence and a farmhouse on the horizon. I walked there, my body exhausted, and knocked on the door. A man answered, looking at me suspiciously. I explained that my car had been stolen and asked if he could help me get into town. He studied me for a moment and then said something that made me even more uneasy. "What car? No one has been here all night." My heart raced. I knew it was impossible. How had those men gotten out of there without anyone seeing or hearing anything? I insisted. I said that I had left my car there, that it was impossible for it to just disappear. The man just shook his head and pointed to the road. "If you want to ride into town, I can take you, but I didn't see any cars." At that moment, I realized that continuing to question wouldn't do any good. My body was crushed. My mind was still spinning, trying to find an explanation. But nothing made sense. I accepted the ride, and during the ride, I stared out the window, trying to understand what the hell had happened that night. But the more I thought, the more it all seemed unreal. When I finally arrived in the city, the first thing I did was try to file a police report. The police asked for details about the car, its location, what had happened. But when they checked through the system, my car didn't exist in the database either, as if I had never purchased it, as if it had never been registered in my name. I still had the key in my pocket, but it was as if that car had never been part of my life. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who those men were or where my car went. The app never showed that request again, and no one could tell me anything about that house. I've tried to move on, but every time I think about it, the same question haunts me. What if I had looked back when I left the food at the gate? I have worked as a gravedigger for over 15 years. It's not the type of profession that many people choose, but for me it's always been a calm job, without surprises, without rushing. Until that week. The manager called me and said that we needed to clean an old burial plot because the bodies there would be relocated to another space. Nothing out of the ordinary. Old graves without exact records appeared from time to time, and bureaucracy took care of the rest. My job was simple. Open the graves, remove the remains, and ensure everything was done respectfully. But when we opened that particular coffin, I felt a strange chill on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. The body inside, it didn't make sense. The tombstone said that that person had been buried almost 80 years ago, but it looked like the deceased had died yesterday. Pale skin, intact hair, clean nails. No signs of decomposition. I've seen many human remains before, and this wasn't normal. At the time, I joked to myself that someone must have made a mistake in the records and buried the guy a few days ago. But the smell, it didn't smell like a recent corpse or like turned-up earth. Just a heavy air, as if that tomb should not have been disturbed. The helper who was with me also noticed. He looked at me with a pale face and muttered, "This looks weird, man." The manager came to see what was happening, and when he saw the body, he just let out a tired sigh and told us to continue. Register it, and send it to the new batch. It's not the first time we've messed with this one. I didn't understand what he meant by that, but I followed orders. We closed the coffin and transported it to the other side of the cemetery. I thought the job ended there. But the next night, I started to notice that I hadn't finished anything. That night, I stayed late at the cemetery, finishing some chores before heading home. I've always been the skeptical type. I don't believe in these haunting stories, but I confess that I had a strange feeling from the moment we touched that coffin. Around 9 o'clock at night, as I was locking up the tool shed, I saw something in the periphery of my vision. At first, I thought it was one of the cats that usually hang around there. But when I really looked, I saw a figure standing near the lot where the body had been relocated. It was difficult to make out the details in the darkness, but I could clearly see that it was a person, motionless, looking in the direction of the tombs. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out if it was a lost visitor or worse, a vandal. But as soon as I blinked, the figure simply wasn't there anymore. I tried to convince myself that it was tiredness, that I had only imagined it. But the next day, the same thing. When I left the cemetery office, as it was getting dark, I saw the figure again, standing in exactly the same place. Now, with a little more light, I could see that he was wearing dark clothes and he looked faded, like he was out of focus in relation to the rest of the scene. I shouted, asking who it was, but there was no answer, just the wind blowing through the trees. It wasn't the kind of thing you could ignore, so I decided to tell the manager the next day. When I finished speaking, expecting him to laugh or say it was all in my head, he just sighed and rubbed his face, as if he had already expected it. That's when he said those words that chilled my spine. This lot has already been relocated 3 times. The body always finds its way back. I laughed at the time, thinking he was joking, but his tired look said something else. "What do you mean you always find your way back?" I asked, hoping he would explain better. But the manager just shrugged, picked up a clipboard and walked away, as if it were just another normal Wednesday. I had that in my head for the rest of the day. I decided to check the old records, but as expected, they were all messed up. No name, no precise date, just vague mentions of previous relocations and meaningless notes. The only thing consistent was the location. That tomb had been removed several times and somehow always came back as a problem. That night I didn't want to stay at the cemetery after work, but my curiosity was greater. I waited until everyone had left and returned to the lot. The moon lit up the cemetery enough for me to see the basics, and that's when I realized something was wrong. The tomb was open, not destroyed, not messed up, just open, as if someone had removed the coffin lid with all the care in the world. The coffin, which I myself helped carry into that space the day before, was empty. The air became heavy again, as if something was pressing against my chest. Then I heard footsteps in the grass. Not heavy steps, not normal steps. There were slow, shuffling footsteps coming from behind one of the mausoleums. My body locked up. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible, but something was forcing me to look. The sound of footsteps continued, dragging, irregular, as if the thing that made them was not used to walking. When I found the courage to take a step back, the figure appeared. Coming out of the shadow of the mausoleum, she stood there, motionless, looking at me. I couldn't see a face properly, but the shape, the way it was, I knew it. It was him, the body that should have been in that coffin. The same silhouette, the same dark suit, the same suffocating sensation I felt when I opened that tomb for the first time. Only now he wasn't lying down. He was standing. My heart raced, and I felt a chill down my spine that I had never felt before. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure didn't move for a long time. It just stood there, as if it were waiting. Then he took a step. Not fast, not aggressive. Just one step forward. as if he wanted to remind me that he was there, that he saw me. It was enough to make me react. I turned and ran without looking back. I've never been one to believe in these things. I've never been the type to be easily impressed. But at that moment I just wanted to get out of there, as if my life depended on it. When I reached the cemetery gate, I looked back one last time. There was nothing else there. The tomb was closed again, the floor with no sign of footprints, as if nothing had happened. That night I could barely sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, standing there, motionless, looking at me. I tossed and turned in bed, trying to find some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Maybe it was a play of light and shadow. Maybe someone was playing a trick. But how can we explain the open tomb? How to explain the empty coffin? The next day, I returned to the cemetery with that still on my mind. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to make sure I wasn't going crazy. When I arrived at the lot, the tomb was exactly as it should be. Closed, with no sign of anyone having disturbed it. If I hadn't seen it all with my own eyes, I would have thought it was just a nightmare. But it wasn't. The manager found me there, looking at the grave, and before I could say anything, he let out a heavy sigh. "You saw it, right?" Those words made me freeze instantly. He didn't ask what I had only seen with I had seen, as if he already knew exactly what happened. I couldn't respond. I just nodded. He rubbed his hand over his face, looking, tired, and said something that haunts me to this day. "It doesn't matter how many times we move this body. It doesn't matter where we take it. He always comes back." After that, he simply turned his back and went back to the office, as if it was just another annoying work problem. I stood there, looking at the tomb that was supposed to be empty a long time ago. I don't know how, I don't know why, but the body always found its way back. And I never wanted to know what would happen if someone tried to remove it again. I never knew what happens when someone dies for a few seconds. I always thought it was that thing of seeing life pass before your eyes, or a tunnel of light. But what I experienced was different. It was much worse. I was walking home late at night after work when a guy came out of nowhere and pointed a gun at me. I didn't even have time to react properly. I remember feeling the impact before I even heard the shot. An absurd pain in my chest, as if someone had hit me with a hammer. I felt the cold asphalt against my face. And then, nothing. I turned it off. When I woke up, it took a few seconds to understand what had happened. He was still lying on the street, but something felt strange. The city was silent. Not a normal silence, but a heavy silence, as if the air itself was absorbing the sound. I stood up slowly, feeling my chest throbbing, but what scared me wasn't the pain. It was the emptiness around me. No cars passing by, no people on the sidewalks, nothing. Just the lit streetlights and the darkness between them. I looked around, trying to find any sign of life, but everything seemed frozen in time. The store windows still had merchandise displayed. The apartment lights were on, but there was no movement. It was as if the entire city had evaporated. I walked to my building, which was a few blocks away, and the feeling of unreality only increased. My own reflection in the shop windows seemed strange to me, as if it were delayed by half a second, as if I were seeing myself from outside my own body. But I kept walking, trying to find some explanation, something that made sense. I climbed the stairs of my building feeling a constant chill on the back of my neck. The elevator worked, but something inside me told me to avoid it. When I arrived at the door of my apartment, I felt a tightness in my chest. Something was wrong. I opened the door and took a step inside, and it was like the air felt heavier. My apartment was empty. Not like they stole my stuff, but like I never lived there. None of my clothes in the closet, None of my photos on the wall, none of my furniture. The smell of the place was also different, as if it had never been inhabited. Worst of all was the mirror in the hallway. I always had a small crack in the bottom corner, but now it was intact. I went to the kitchen trying to find something, anything, that would prove that this was indeed my home. I opened the fridge, and it was empty. Just a few bottles of water and a jar of mustard. My heart started to race. I picked up my cell phone to call someone, but there was no signal. By this point, I was already fighting panic. I ran to the bedroom and tried to open the dresser drawers. Nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a piece of paper, not a trace that I had ever slept there before. But the worst was yet to come. When I looked out the window, I noticed that the city looked wrong. Buildings were in place, but the lights flickered strangely, out of sync. Some would go out for seconds and then light up as if nothing had happened. And down there, in the street, a man stood, looking straight at my window. I stood still for a while, trying to understand what was happening. The man below didn't move. He was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, under a flickering streetlight. Even from far away, I felt like he was looking right at me. My chest still hurt. My mind was spinning, trying to find some logical explanation. Was I dreaming? In shock? But it all felt real. The cold texture of the ground beneath my feet, the weight of my breath in my chest, the sweat dripping down my forehead. I took a step back, away from the window, and when I looked again, he wasn't there anymore. My stomach sank. There was nowhere he could have gone so fast. I felt a shiver run down my back. I left the room and went back to the living room, trying to think of what to do. That's when I heard a noise coming from the building's hallway. Steps, slow, drawn out, but heavy. My heart raced. I approached the door carefully and looked through the peephole. The hallway looked normal except for one thing. The light was flashing in exactly the same rhythm as the streetlights. That's when I realized. There was someone standing in front of my door. It didn't knock, it didn't try to open, it just was there. The feeling was that the person knew I was looking. I walked away slowly, without making a sound. But the moment I looked up from the viewfinder, I heard a whisper on the other side of the door. Low, hoarse, impossible to understand. My entire body froze. My first instinct was to lock the door, but it was already locked. I walked away slowly, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. The whispering stopped, but the presence on the other side was still there. The entire corridor seemed to be waiting for something. It was then that I noticed something that made me hold my breath. The doorknob. She was spinning. Not slowly, not forcefully, but in a strange way, as if the person on the other side didn't know exactly how to open a door, as if they were trying to understand the mechanism. With each movement, a faint creak echoed through the silent apartment. My whole body wanted to run, but my legs felt stuck to the ground. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to convince myself that I was imagining everything. But when I opened them again, something changed. The rattling of the doorknob stopped. Silence returned. But now it felt different. More oppressive. I stood there, waiting for something to happen, but nothing. I gathered courage and looked through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. The light was still flickering, but there was no one there. My stomach dropped. I knew there was someone there before. I had heard. I had felt it. But now, nothing. That's when I realized something else. The door. I didn't remember unlocking it, but now. The lock was open. My entire body seized up. I knew I hadn't unlocked the door, but there it was, open, as if inviting me to leave. My fingers shook as I reached for the doorknob, hesitating. I didn't want to open up, but part of me knew that if I didn't, I would never understand what was happening. I took a deep breath and slowly pulled the door open. The hallway was empty, but the silence seemed even deeper. I took a step outside, looking around. Nothing. Just the hallway. The doors closed, the lights flickering. But when I looked at the ground, I felt my blood run cold. Wet. Footprints, as if someone had walked barefoot to my door, and then disappeared. I swallowed hard and backed away, closing the door again. My mind tried to find a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. I walked to the kitchen, trying to calm down, drink some water, anything to bring me back to reality. That's when I noticed something else. On the table, right in front of me, was a plate of food. Rice, meat, a glass of juice on the side, a half-eaten meal. My heart almost stopped. I hadn't done that. I didn't remember eating anything. My hands started to sweat, and that's when a terrifying thought occurred to me. What if this apartment had never been mine? What if I was in the wrong place the whole time? My breathing became heavy. I stared at that plate for long seconds, waiting for my mind to give me some memory, some trace that it made sense. But nothing. No flash, no detail lost in memory. It was as if someone had been there, eaten half the meal, and just gone. The smell of the food was still fresh. The juice seemed cold. I approached slowly, feeling a cold take over my body. I touched the glass with my fingertips. It was cold. Someone had been here. But who? And why? It was at that moment that everything started to spin. My chest hurt. My head throbbed. It was like my body was shutting down. I leaned on the table, trying to stay upright, but everything was getting dark. The silence around me seemed to grow, to become almost solid. Then, suddenly, a snap. Something snapped in my mind, like a rope being pulled too hard. My body collapsed, and before everything went dark, I swear I saw someone in the window's reflection. I didn't see the face, I didn't see details, but there was someone there, standing behind me. I woke up suddenly, as if I had been pulled back into my body. My chest burned. My head felt like it was being squeezed. Everything was different. I was no longer in my apartment, nor in that strange, silent world. I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and tubes attached to my arm. My mouth was dry. My throat hurt. It took me a few seconds to understand where I was, to process what was happening. A doctor came and told me I was lucky. The bullet almost hit my heart, but they managed to stabilize me in time. He spoke, but my mind was far away. What if it was all just a delusion, an effect of trauma, of blood loss? But then, something made me freeze. When I returned home, everything seemed normal. My furniture was, there. My clothes, my photos, everything where it should be. But there were small differences, details that only I would notice. My couch was a few inches out of place. My books on the shelf were organized in a way I would never leave them. And the worst part, on the kitchen table there was a plate with food, rice, meat, a glass of juice on the side. Exactly as before. Exactly like that other place. I stopped at the entrance to the kitchen, feeling a shiver run down my spine. My chest hurt. Again, but now it wasn't from the bullet, it was fear.